So I'm not going to try and explain this next segment that I'm going to show you, which is an excerpt from Haymarket Books on YouTube, and it is featuring Harsha Walia, who is an author and activist, and I'll read a little bit about her. But her book, Borders and Rule, seems like it's very interesting, and I'm going to get a hold of that soon. And I thought I would share some excerpts from it because it's I think it's important information. And on a site called Women and Children First, they do a brief synopsis of what her book is about, and it says, in Border and Rule, one of North America's foremost thinkers, immigrant rights organizers, delivers an unflinching examination of migration as a pillar of global governance and gendered racial class formation. Harsha Walia disrupts easy explanations for the migrant and refugee crisis, instead showing them to be the inevitable outcomes of conquest, capitalist globalization, and climate change, generating mass dispossession worldwide. Border and Rule explores a number of seemingly disparate global geographies with shared logistics of border rule that displace, immobilize, criminalize, exploit, and expel migrants and refugees. With her keen ability to connect the dots, Walia demonstrates how borders divide the international working class and consolidate imperial capitalist ruling class and racist nationalist rule. Ambitious in scope and internationalist in orientation, Border and Rule breaks through American exceptionalist and liberal responses to the migration crisis and cogently maps the lucrative connections between state violence, capitalism, and right-wing nationalism around the world. Illuminating the brutal mechanics of state formation, Walia exposes U.S. border policy as a product of violent territorial expansion, settler colonialism, enslavement, and gendered racial exclusion. Further, she compellingly details how Fortress Europe and White Australia are using immigration, diplomacy, and externalized borders to maintain a colonial presence, how temporary labor migration in Arab Gulf states and Canada is central to citizen regulation and labor control, and how far-right nationalism is escalating deadly violence in the US, Israel, India, the Philippines, Brazil, and across Europe, while producing a disaster of statelessness for millions elsewhere. A must-read in these difficult times of war, inequality, climate change, and global health crisis, Border and Rule is a clarion call for revolution. The book includes a foreword from renowned scholar Robin D.J. Kelly and an afterword from acclaimed activist academic Nick Estes. About the author, Harsha Walia is the award-winning author of Undoing Border Imperialism, 2013. Trained in the law, she is a community organizer and campaigner in migrant justice, anti-capitalist, feminist, and anti-imperialist movements, including No One Is Illegal and Women's Memorial March Committee. So anyway, I'll show you. I'm not going to try and explain it. I have a superficial understanding of some of the things she talks about, and she can do it much better than I can. And she's I find her really an amazing speaker. She's got such depth of knowledge and communicates that incredibly well. So I haven't posted anything the last few days, which is unusual for me. Two things I try to, unless I find something I think is compelling for me to talk about, I usually don't. And also, I went on these medication for something, and it had the side effect, which they didn't tell me about, which was that it makes you feel incredibly tired. And in the middle of the day, basically, I would have to go and lay down and sleep. Fortunately, I'm coming off them now, but it was basically I was falling asleep in front of my monitor. That's how sad the side effects of that were. So anyway, that's one of the reasons anyway why I was missing for the last few days. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this next, there's about 20 minutes all up, I think, of Harsha Walia talking about this issue. So thanks for watching. My name is Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Riga. Till next time, stay tuned. Bye for now.
And thinking about how crucial it is to understand that racism underpins capitalism, right? That there is no capitalism that is not racial, and that there is no meaningful anti-racism that is not also anti-capitalist, that we cannot separate out capitalism from racial dispossession. And, borders really act as like a spatial fix for capitalism by creating an exploitable pool of labor, right? The very kind of naming of migrant workers as migrants really kind of fractures the working class and fractures the class, as you said it. And, the ways in which migrant workers operates, I think, is it's really just a euphemism for third world workers, right? Like when people are talking about migrant workers, they're just meaning to say third world workers. And they're talking about the workers that can't be outsourced, that need to be insourced. They're the flip sides of the same kind of capitalist coin, right? The jobs that can't be outsourced are now being insourced. And this is basically deliberately deflated labor power. And the denial of permanent immigration status and the racialization of migrant workers as quote unquote foreigners normalizes the racism, right? So they're legal but deportable labor. And I think this is important because the border does not only act to exclude and deport people, but it also acts to create the condition of deportability, right? Which is to say that you might be deported, but if you stay compliant, you will not be deported, right? And that really is, again, looking at the Bracero program or the H2 program or the H2A program. And in the U.S., Thomas Friedman, who we'll all know is basically a pro-democratic party commentator. He wrote this op-ed, and he said that the solution to the immigration crisis is, quote, a high wall with a big gate, but a smart gate. And the smart gate that Thomas Friedman and other neoliberals are talking about is they're talking about labor migration, right? They're talking about we don't need a wall. Like we can't block everybody. We just need to make sure that people are coming. They can stay legally, but we need to make sure that they're coming tied to an employer, right? They're coming tied in this kind of current day indentureship. And these are, this is the ways in which I think the border is really crucial and plays a central pillar in modern day racial capitalism, right? Because the border acts as a spatial fix to capital accumulation, and it ensures that there's always a cheapened pool of labor, right? So it's a key method of state violence in neoliberalism to collapse labor power and political power, because we know that, the way kind of one of the key methods of union busting is to hold workers kind of hostage to the threat of both termination and deportation, right? Like that's how these programs work. And we saw that recently in the massive raids in Mississippi, right, where 680 workers were raided in an ICE raid just after a very successful unionization drive, and just coincidentally after they filed a lawsuit for discrimination and sexual harassment. And according to one study in the U.S., 52% of companies in the U.S. threatened to call immigration authorities on workers during union drives, right? So this is really crucial. It's a crucial method of accumulation and enacting and perpetuating racism, right, as a race-making regime. And so here's where I think the kind of left nationalism is something that we need to talk about, because one of the most dangerous forms of white supremacist nationalism on the left today is the animation of the working class along nationalist lines, right? And we hear this in refrains like, quote unquote, taking care of ourselves before others, American jobs for Americans, or the idea of foreign workers are driving down wages. And I think this kind of call to protect our jobs from migrants not only presupposes that migrants are not also part of the working class, when in fact they are, and often, of course, at the forefront of working class struggles, but also it actively pits workers against each other, right? Like migrant workers are not the ones who are suppressing wages. It's the bosses and the borders that are doing that work. And so this kind of nationalism may seem progressive, but it's really reactionary. It's a ruling class kind of nationalism. And I think in our struggles against capitalism, we have to remember that the enemy arrives in a limousine and not on a boat, right? Like that's a really powerful slogan that we've seen. And this kind of nationalist protectionism isn't new, but it's being reanimated, right? So in the early 1900s and late 1800s, it was the kind of ways in which unions really rallied against quote unquote Asian coolie labor. And also, this is controversial, but I'd be remiss in not mentioning it, the ways in which Cesar Chavez, right, famed farm leader Cesar Chavez, really organized against undocumented and migrant workers, and actually was involved in a campaign against a campaign of reporting undocumented workers to federal authorities, right? So for Cesar Chavez, undocumented workers were strikebreakers, right? But I think, you know, these kinds of calls to deport or to not allow migrant workers, they're not only immoral, which they're immoral, but they're also strategically flawed because they don't understand that the border is a method for capital, right? The border is not going to protect us against capitalist globalization. And I think that's where unions, or many unions, have got it wrong, right? So when they're saying keep jobs out of the hands of foreign workers as a defense against neoliberal globalization, they're not seeing the ways in which capital actually requires the border to produce immobilized labor. And, you know, I think this is something that we need to be really cautious about. This is something that's taking hold in Canada and the United States. It's kind of, you know, it's one of the impacts of austerity and that kind of scarcity and protectionist logic. It's also taking hold in the UK. So in the UK, in response to a pro-migration platform in the UK's Labour Party, there was the creation of a new organization that calls itself Blue Labour, which organizes around the principle of nationalist socialism, right? So these are very worrying trends. And I think the only way that we fight back against this kind of seemingly progressive, but really reactionary nationalism is to actually organize for immigration status and labor protection and living wages for all workers, right? To make the divisions created by the border obsolete. Because otherwise, if we continue to create this division between, you know, so-called citizen workers and migrant workers, that's really maintaining the international division of labor upon which capitalism relies. And it aligns, of course, as you said, with far-right racism, right? It blunts class consciousness through racism. And so I think, you know, that is crucial. I'll say briefly, because I know we're wrapping up for time, the other kinds of left-wing nationalisms, or, you know, I don't know if left-wing is the word because it's the appropriation of the left, is, of course, really reactionary left-wing feminism. You know, the week that Border and Rule launched this week, it was published the same day that Border and Rule released, another book was released that's kind of topped bestseller charts. And it's a book called, quote unquote, Prey, Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. And it's a bestseller on gender theory right now, right? And so, you know, I'm sorry, I'm going to pollute the airwaves with this, or the internet waves with this, but the premise of this book is, quote, why are so few people talking about the eruption of sexual violence and harassment in Europe's cities? No one in a position of power wants to admit that the problem is linked to the arrival of several million migrants, most of them young men from Muslim-majority countries, end quote, right? So this kind of reinvigorated anti-migrant, anti-Black, Islamophobic discourse is taking hold under the guise of feminism. And of course, we've also seen this in the white feminist savior missions and, you know, laws banning the niqab or burqa across Europe and also in Canada. And so this kind of appropriation of gender and sexuality in the service of nationalist power is one that we have to also be really cautious about, right? And this has a capacious trajectory. This is not limited to this moment. We know that imperial feminism has justified military interventions to supposedly save women from patriarchy. Homo nationalism claims to liberate queers from supposedly sexually repressive cultures. Carceral feminism vindicates prison expansion under the guise of victims' rights. And also trans-exclusionary feminism reduces gender to biological determinism, right? So there's many ways in which we need to be thoughtful about the appropriation of feminism in the service of racist nationalism. And eco-apartheid it's a big one, but I think, you know, again, we need to, eco-apartheid is squarely, you know, a fascist force, right? It's a tool in the arsenal of white nationalism. But I think there's also liberals who are increasingly latching on to variants of eco-fascism in progressive movements, right? And We can't forget that in the 1990s and early 2000s, the Sierra Club was embroiled in these vicious debates about immigration and population control, where many Sierra Club members advocated for immigration restriction as a method of environmental protection, right? And so, especially with, the rise, of course, of the climate crisis and the warming of our planet, I think we need to be really cautious about and, thoroughly reject any kind of eco-fascist tendency in environmental and progressive movements that takes up this kind of immigration restriction as a method of environmental protection, right? And one thing that's worrying is in France, Marine Le Pen, who's a far-right politician, she's been making inroads in some environmental movements in that country with her new kind of screed of, quote, borders are the environment's greatest ally. It is through them that we will save the planet, right? So, these kinds of ways in which really racist discourses of eco-apartheid, of feminism, of class struggle are showing up at the expense of migrants, but really at the expense of all racialized peoples, is absolutely something that we need to be thinking about, and more importantly, we need to reject. NAFTA is, it's the world's largest trade agreement. And, one thing is that I think we tend to think about trade agreements as like a new phenomenon, but they really just perpetuate the old pattern that the British East India Company used, which is to use trade to subordinate markets for the benefit of imperial ruling class interests, right? And today there's, over 400 trade agreements that were negotiated in the span of 10 years. And with NAFTA, I mean, in brief, what NAFTA did was really privatize national industries, deregulated the public sector in Mexico, and really protected corporate property rights, right, through what's called this clause called investor-state arbitration, which basically means that companies can sue national economies if they don't make the profit that they thought that they were going to make. Natural resources are extracted, and state subsidies are removed. And so that's really the staple of all trade agreements, and really was critical to the implementation of NAFTA. The two particular things that I'll just say about NAFTA is that, NAFTA removed Mexican state tariffs on subsidized U.S. meat and agricultural exports. So that ended up flooding the market with genetically modified cash crops like corn, right? And that's which is why to the EZLN, to the Zapatistas, to the National Liberation Army, that is why corn is a symbol of the resistance, right? That is precisely why, is because the markets have been flooded with shitty GMO cash crops that are subsidized by the United States, while maize and corn, which is sacred in indigenous communities and that is central to indigenous food sovereignty, has been destroyed, right? So the decimation of thousands of varieties of native corn across indigenous lands in what we know as Mexico. And that this is a form of genocide, right? This is a form of genocide. To enact violence on food sovereignty is a form of genocide. And it disproportionately impacts indigenous women harvesters. And so that is why corn is a symbol of Zapatista resistance. And at the same time, while Mexican tariffs had to be removed on subsidized U.S. exports, the Mexican government was forced to eliminate any price controls on corn or tortillas that were produced in Mexico, right? So you have this kind of flooding of the market phenomenon. The other key aspect of NAFTA was amendments to the Mexican Constitution, including the abolition of Article 27. Now, Article 27 was enshrined in the Mexican Constitution after the revolutionary 1917 Constitution, right? So as part of a victory of the revolution, and for decades had affirmed this national control over resources and protected communal land redistribution through ejidos. And so NAFTA forced open these kind of communal non-capitalist forms of social organization and land organization, the ways in which indigenous social organization held land in common, or peasant communities held land in common, to fee simple private ownership, right? The typical capitalist model of private ownership. And then later reforms even sanctioned land seizures for debt collection, coming back to Robin's point about debt. And so, indebted farmers lost their lands, including to U.S. agribusinesses, to multinational corporations. And in 2014, it's estimated that as much as 20% of land in Mexico was designated for mining interests, 70% of which is owned by U.S. and Canadian mining giants, right? So this is the kind of cumulative effects of NAFTA led to a massive crisis of displacement, which included displaced farmers now working as farm workers in southern United States and all throughout the United States, and also an explosion in the maquiladora industry, right, which also saw a vast expansion of 80% within the first 5 years of NAFTA, and really here we saw the kind of growing feminization as well. And that's one of the key features of free trade agreements is mass dispossession, and it takes it has a particularly gendered impact because it distorts the social organization and the gender relations that especially indigenous and peasant communities have to the land, right? Those non-capitalist relations to the land, and so that is precisely why the Zapatistas rose up in national rebellion, in armed rebellion. And, when NAFTA was signed, the day that it was signed, the Zapatistas said the agreement would be a death sentence to indigenous nations and indigenous communities in Mexico. And that is what happened. And after NAFTA, the kind of proportion of migrants who are indigenous that are displaced and have now become migrants, right? Forcibly become migrants is 29%. Like that's the most recent estimate. So in terms of the connections between NAFTA and displacement and the impact on indigenous communities and border militarization, like the connections are seamless. Difficult to speak on what form indigenous sovereignty would take because, of course, I think one of the things that we have to be careful about is the idea of like a pan-indigenous approach, right? Indigenous communities and indigenous nations all have their own articulations of what indigenous self-determination looks like. And here, of course, I'm also thinking about indigenous self-determination, not only in the context of settler colonial states that I'm located on, like Canada, or where I assume most people are listening in from in the United States, but I'm thinking here of indigenous sovereignty and self-determination globally, right? Thinking about what freedom means for Kashmir, thinking about what freedom means for Palestine, thinking of what freedom means for Kurdistan, right? Thinking about many, many people for whom freedom is, freedom is the freedom dreams are still lingering, to quote Robin, for all people and most people, but just to name a few. And so I think, in terms of borders, I think what is important to remember about borders is borders are fundamentally a creation of the current state of colonial capitalism, right? Like, we're not talking about borders as any kind of way in which people choose to mark their presence or to understand their self-determination. So, for example, the Wet'suwet'en Nation, a sovereign indigenous nation who exactly 1 year ago today faced down the full might of the Canadian state in a highly militarized raid. When people enter into their nation, into their community, they ask a series of questions, right? Which is, and I'm paraphrasing here, but they ask a series of questions, which is, why are you here? How will your presence benefit the community? And do you work for the state or industry, right? And so, I've often been asked, right, like, how do you as a no border activist justify and how are you okay with and how do you support walking through that kind of border checkpoint? And I'm just like, that's laughable to call that a border checkpoint. That's like, that's offensive. That's, a nation who's expressing its self-determination and asking the very legitimate questions that we should all be asking when people enter into our community, right? Like, are you a cop? Do you work for the state? Do you work for industry? That's like a standard question for any social movement to be asking. And, what skills do you bring? How's your work benefit all of us? And how can we benefit you? That really is the ways in which we create kinship. That's the ways in which we create social relations. And so I don't think accountability, accountability is not carceral. Accountability is not the border. And so I think, having utmost respect and understanding of Indigenous history and Indigenous laws and Indigenous jurisdiction as a form of self-determination doesn't necessarily mean we're reproducing the state. We're only reproducing the state if it takes the form of the state, right? But that those aren't necessarily those aren't necessary corollaries. When I think of Indigenous self-determination, I'm also thinking of non-capitalist modes of production that we were talking about earlier, thinking about expansive ways of thinking about kinship. And so for me, they're not dichotomous, and they're not antithetical to each other. To think about a world without borders, and to think about a world without private property, and to think about a world without police and prisons and military and sweatshops, to think about all of those, that vision of abolition and decolonization and no borders, I think are necessarily interconnected, and they're not in opposition to each other. Absolutely, there is a profit motive to the border industrial complex, just like there is a profit motive to the prison industrial complex, right? And that there are many, many companies, depending on, which state you're looking at, whether it's the US or Europe or Canada, who are invested in expanding the border industrial complex because they get contracts from it, whether it's contracts for virtual surveillance, whether it's contracts for detention, right? So there's a profit motive. However, similar to the arguments around the prison industrial complex, it's important not to reduce these forms of state violence to the profit motive alone, right? And especially if we look at it globally, the border industrial complex is sanctioned and authorized by the state. It may be expanded as a result of the profit motive, but in many states, actually, the border apparatus is fully nationalized. It doesn't have the same profit motive as, say, the United States does with mass private detention. And so I think it's really important to always remember the centrality of state violence, and that the state and capitalism are constitutive of each other. The state is the method through which capitalism expands. It's the method through which capitalism is grounded. It's the entire legal regime for capitalism is contained through the state. And also that the state, the border industrial complex that is intended to capture, to contain migrants and refugees, to also create pliable labor, to create the conditions of deportation and deportability, that is all a function of the state, working in tandem with capitalism. And so I think it's important to hold both of those together. And to not solely place the responsibility of the border industrial complex, like the prison industrial complex, solely on private corporations. Because even if you have a fully state-run border industrial complex, it is still violent.